Welcome to Team SNG deck profile. This month we are going to be profiling my favorite deck, Crusadia Mekk Knight. This is an amazing deck. It's got so much ability to play going first or going second, especially with one of our new additions that we have in here. If you'd like to see the original deck profile, link is down below. While you're at your attention, I'd like to ask you, do leave us a like, leave us a comment, leave us a subscribe. Also, check out Team's Patreon and Facebook. Both of them will be linked below as well. What I love about this deck is that this deck has the ability, as I say, to play first and play second. But what it really has the ability to do is create such an interesting lock utilizing the World Legacy Spell Trap lineup and the Mekk Knight monsters themselves. And that lets you lock your opponent out of being able to use monster spells and or traps, depending on what spell traps you have set up on the field. The Crusadia element, going first or going second, lets you set up link zones, but also lets you potentially set up an OTK, as well as get into the big boss monster of Mekk Knight Crusadia Avermax. So that being said, let's get into it. The first card that we're going to talk about is the new addition that we just mentioned that allows the Mekk Knight and the Crusadia engine to both pop off with one normal summon, and that is Gearsuit, the Orcus Mekk Knight. This is a level 4 monster. When it is summoned by either normal summon or special summon, you get to send an Orcus or World Legacy card from the deck to the graveyard. So in Orcus, this obviously sets up their whole engine. But in this deck, what it lets you do is it lets you send a World Legacy card to the graveyard and effectively set up zones that your Mekk Knights can summon themselves to, as it will then produce 2 tokens, one on your field and one on your opponent's field. So you can produce a token opposite one of the extra monster zones and then link this and a token off for something in our extra deck, producing a column for your Mekk Knights. On top of that, it will also let you send World Legacy World Chalice to the graveyard, which will let you search out a World Legacy Spell Trap on your next turn. So it does set yourself up for building this lock that we've already discussed. It does have an additional effect that if there are 2 cards in the column when this is normal summoned, you can treat this as a tuner, allowing you to use it for synchro plays. Now obviously we're not doing that in this deck, that's not the focus that this deck has, but it is just something that this card can do. Next, we're going to talk about the Mekk Knights. The first Mekk Knight that we run is our big beefy boy in Mekk Knight Purple Nightfall. We run 3 copies of him. He's our main searcher. Like all the Mekk Knights, if there's 2 cards in a column, you can special summon him to a zone you control in that column. But the best thing that he has is, as a quick effect, he can banish a Mekk Knight on your field to search a Mekk Knight out of the deck. And then during your standby phase, that monster comes back. That monster returning doesn't count as a summon because it is just returned. So it does play around Nibiru. Our other searcher for the Mekk Knight engine is Mekk Knight Blue Sky. This card, again, can be summoned to a zone that you control where there are 2 cards in that zone's column. But the big thing this does is it lets you add from your deck to your hand Mekk Knights equal to the number of other cards in this card's column. So on top of that, we then run the next big boy in our Mekk Knight Indigo Eclipse. Now this is what gives this deck such a big control element. As a quick effect, you can move a Mekk Knight from one column to another column. And pairing that with the World Legacy Spell Trap lineup in World Legacy Secrets, World Legacy Whispers, and World Legacy Key, that lets you turn off different zones for monsters, spells, and traps, respectively. We do run a couple other Mekk Knights just to make sure that we aren't going to be unable to resolve Blue Sky's effect. The first is Mekk Knight Yellow Star, and the second is Mekk Knight Red Moon. They both have a targeted pop effect. Yellow Star targets and pops back row, and Red Moon targets and pops monsters. So they have effects where they can target a card in their column and pop it. Onto the Crusadia part of this, we run a very robust Crusadia package, as the Crusadias are what really gives the deck the ability to go first, because if you use them as your normal summon rather than your Gearsuit, the Orcus Mekk Knight, then what you can do is, instead of using this as your normal summon, you can use a Crusadia and link it off for their link 1, and that will then let you combo off, because you can build a column with that link monster and a spell trap, or you can continue down the Crusadia line and just continue link summoning and special summoning to the zones the link monsters point to. So the first Crusadia monster we run is 3 copies of Crusadia Maximus. He lets you grant double damage to the link monster he points to. He also can special summon himself to a zone a link monster points to. So again, as I say, it's an extender, and that's why we run such a robust Crusadia package, is because they are basically just extenders for the entire deck. The next one is Crusadia Draco. Now this is your recursion. When he is special summoned to a zone a link monster points to, you get to add a Crusadia back from your deck to your hand. Next we run Crusadia Arborea. We run 3 copies of this as well. That is because this card is your protection. You get to banish this from your graveyard to protect a Crusadia on the field from being destroyed. So again, this can protect your big boss monster and Mekk Knight Crusadia Avermax, but at the end of the day, it can protect any of your Crusadia cards. That does it for the 3 ofs for Crusadias that we run. We do run a couple 2 ofs in Crusadia Leonis, which grants your link monsters piercing damage, and Crusadia Reclusia, which it targets a Crusadia card that you control and a monster and a card on your opponent's side of the field and pops them both. This partners really well actually with Crusadia Arborea, because instead of popping the card that this targets on your side of the field, you can banish your Arborea to protect that card and just take something off of your opponent's field. Finally, the last monster that we run is 2 copies of World Legacy World Chalice. Now, we're really only running this for its second effect, which is that during your main phase, other than the turn it was sent to the grave, you can banish this to search out a World Legacy card and add it to your hand. So, basically, the main idea is that what you're going to do is you're going to normal summon your Girsu and send this to the grave. That then means that on your next turn, you're going to be able to search out one of your World Legacy spell traps that you might require. On top of that, you can then, as I stated, use Girsu's effect to go into something in our extra deck to set another one directly to the field. That does it for our monsters. On to our spells. First, we're going to talk about the one Crusadia spell we run in the main deck, and that is Crusadia Power. This just makes sure your combo goes off without a hitch. You can activate this, and a Crusadia monster on your side of the field will be unaffected by card effects for the rest of the turn. So you can use this to make sure that your searches go through and things like that. But realistically, we're only running one because we have a way of searching it out that we can get out of the extra deck, and it's really not that important that our searches go through on our Crusadia cards necessarily. It's more important actually that our searches go through off of our Mekk Knights. Typically, you don't need to see this, but it's not a bad option to have available to you in certain circumstances. So that's why we only run 1 copy of it. Onto the World Legacy spells that we run. We first run 2 copies of World Legacy Succession, special summon from the grave, just a bit of recursion. 2 copies of World Legacy's Memory. This lets us special summon a Mekk Knight from the deck. Typically what you're going to want to special summon off this is Purple Sky. Then you banish Purple Sky, get a search off of that, and then continue comboing off that way. The one thing that you do need to be aware of is if you activate World Legacy's Memory, you are going to be locked into Mekk Knights for the rest of the turn. So certain cards in your extra deck may no longer be available to you. So you do need to be a bit careful of that. The other thing you could do, though, is you could use this to get your Girsu, the Orcish Mekk Knight, onto the field if you don't have it in your opening hand. And finally, we run 1 copy of World Legacy Key. Now we do run a couple extra copies of this in the side deck, but it lets you add a banished Mekk Knight back to your hand. But the real reason we run this is because it turns off trap effects in the same column as a Mekk Knight monster you control. So if your opponent was to activate a trap card in the column you control a Mekk Knight, that trap card's effect does not go off. Now the way that this works with Indigo Eclipse is you can move Indigo Eclipse to a column when your opponent activates the trap card, and that will negate that trap card's effect. And so that's how you control the board state and stop your opponent's traps from going off. That does it for our spells. Onto our traps. We run, much like our spells, we run 1 Crusadia card. Crusadia Crawler. Now this is a really interesting card. Again, it lets you search out your World Legacy cards. So if this card is activated, you get to special summon this card to your field. If it's special summoned to a zone a link monster points to, you get to search a World Legacy card out of your deck. And so what you're going to do is you're going to search for one of your World Legacy spell traps that you want to stop, that you want available to you, so as to stop your opponent's monster spells or trap effects going off. So we've spoken about the spell card that turns off traps. Let's talk about the trap card that turns off spells. And that is World Legacy Whispers. Now, World Legacy Whispers is an interesting card. You can target a level 5 monster on your side of the field, and it gains 1,000 attack. The other thing this does, though, is this makes it so the activated effects of spells in the same column as a Mekk Knight are negated. So what you do is you activate this and you move your Mekk Knights around using Indigo Eclipse to negate spells now instead of traps. The reason we run 2 of this is there are less decks that are reliant on spells than monsters, but the reason we run 2 of this is there are more decks reliant on spells than traps. We do run 1 extra copy in the side deck, and that is literally just because if you end up in a spell-heavy matchup, you want to have access to this. Finally, we run 3 copies of World Legacy Secret. This card lets you special summon a level 5 or higher monster from your grave back to the field. The other thing this does is it turns off monster effects in the same column as a Mekk Knight. Now, one thing you do need to be aware of, if you special summon something back and this card gets popped, that card will also leave the field. So you do need to be aware of the fact that your card is your monster that you bring back with this is susceptible to being removed if your opponent was to pop this card. So you also need to find a way to protect this as well. That does it for the main deck. Real quick, we're going to talk about the side deck. We do run a few cards in the side. I don't normally talk about the side, but this is specific to this deck, and that's why we're going to bring it up. I run 1 copy of Crusadia Testament. It's extra draw power, assuming you go into your Crusadia engine. You activate this when your Crusadia monster destroys an opponent's monster by battle, and you draw cards up to equal to its link rating. So this can let you draw up to 4 cards if you have Mekk Knight Crusadia Avermax on board, or 3 cards with Crusadia Equimax. As stated earlier, we do run 2 copies of World Legacy Key for those trap lineups. We want to swap out maybe our World Legacy Whispers for World Legacy Key, things like that. And we also run 1 copy of World Legacy Whispers for those spell-heavy lineups where maybe we're going to take out that World Legacy Key and we'll put in the World Legacy Whispers. So that just lets us play the deck against whatever our opponents might be playing. Let's talk about the Crusadia engine yet again. We'll talk about that first. First is Crusadia Magius. This is the link 1 alluded to earlier. What this takes is it requires 1 Crusadia monster. But what happens is if a monster is special summoned to the zone this card points to, you get to search a Crusadia monster from your deck to your hand. And all the Crusadia monsters will special summon themselves to a zone a link monster points to. So they sort of feed off each other that way. Next, you've got Crusadia Regulex. This lets you search a Crusadia spell trap. And again, it gains the attack of whatever it points to, much like Crusadia Magius. And finally, in the pure Crusadia build lineup, we have 2 copies of Crusadia Equimax. This is the link 3. This again gains the attack of everything it points to. And it has the ability to tribute a card it points to so as to negate an effect. So it gives you a negation on your opponent's turn if you need it. On to the Mekk Knights, we run 2 copies of Mekk Knight of the Morning Star. This card is really, really good for this deck. Your opponent can no longer deal battle damage or destroy Mekk Knights unless they attack it with a monster in the same column as the Mekk Knight they are battling. Meaning if you set yourself up well, your opponent can't get rid of your boss monster unless they attack over it using something in the same column, and your boss monster is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger as we go. And we'll see that in just a moment. On top of that, you can send a Mekk Knight or World Legacy card from your hand to the graveyard to add a World Legacy card from your deck to your hand, which will allow you to set yourself up really well because you can search out one of the spell traps you maybe don't have at the point where you've put this on the field. Next, we have Mekk Knight Spectrum Supreme. I don't really go into this very much, but I like to have the option of going into him. If it's the only card in its column, it can attack your opponent directly for 3,000 damage, which is really good. And if it's in the extra monster zone and points to no cards, it can't be destroyed by card effects. So you could set this up in your extra monster zone and maybe move your Indigo Eclipse out from underneath it when your opponent goes to pop it, and that would stop your opponent from being able to destroy this by card effect, which can be useful as well. And on top of that, you can special summon a Mekk Knight from the deck by sending a card you control in this card's column to the graveyard. So this, again, a bit more searchability. As you can see, the Mekk Knights all search each other, the Crusadias all search each other, the Mekk Knights also search your World Legacy stuff, your World Legacy stuff searches the Mekk Knights. It all feeds into each other really, really well. So that does it for the pure Mekk Knight build. Now for the big, big boss monster of the deck, and that is Mekk Knight Crusadia Avermax. This is my favorite card. Basically, he's self-honest if he battles a special summon monster, and he's a big 3,000 attack beater, and on top of that, if your opponent does get it off the board, it bounces something back to the deck. Now on to the love of Avermax's life, Lib, the World Key Blade Master. What she does is, when she is summoned, you can set a World Legacy spell trap directly from your deck to the field. She only requires 2 monsters, meaning it's really easy to set her up by using Girsu, setting up Girsu and the token, linking Girsu the token off for this, and that will let you set one of your World Legacy spell traps directly to the field, which then means that you've probably already started setting yourself up overall for your lockout field with Whispers, Secrets, Key, because you've already got one of them on the field, and you've potentially set yourself up where next turn you can search out a second one. And that's all off of a single normal summon, which is really, really good. Now for some more free agent-ish cards we run. We run 1 copy of IP Masquerena, because IP Masquerena plus another link to going into Avermax makes Avermax indestructible once per turn, which is really good. He can be destroyed, but he can't be targeted with card effects, so he's already protected from targeting, and he's the only thing your opponent can battle while he's on the field. So IP Masquerena making it so he can't be destroyed once per turn is really powerful. Then we run Boral Sword and Boral Load. These are just the link 4s that we have as options to go into. This OTK is like nobody's business, and this just makes it so you can start taking stuff off of your opponent's board if you need to. That's it for our extra deck. So the thing, as I say, I love about this deck is it can go first or go second. Going first, you really can lean into your Crusadias, as they make it really easy to climb through their little link engine all the way up to your big boss monster of Crusadia Mekk Knight Crusadia Avermax. Now, this is really good. On top of that, they let you set columns up, because once you get to the link 2, you've probably searched out a spell trap, which means that you can set that underneath the link 2, creating columns for your Mekk Knight, so it fuels your Mekk Knight engine that way. And at the end of it, you end up with a Mekk Knight on board, meaning that if you get any of the spell traps for the Mekk Knight, you could start negating stuff off of your opponent's board, so long as it's in the same column as him. Going second, what you want to do is lean into your Mekk Knight, seeing as they're all quite big monsters who can special summon themselves directly from the hand, so long as your opponent's helped you out by setting cards in columns, letting you put a card in your column and set them up. We run enough spell traps that we should easily be able to set up columns if our opponent has built a board, so getting Mekk Knights onto the board is not a problem. And again, they work really well with Crusadia Avermax because he protects them, and then they negate things so long as they're combined with their spell trap lineup in the World Legacy cards. On top of that, being able to build the board where you have your World Legacy cards is a lot easier now that we have access to Girsu the Orcus Mekk Knight. The ability to summon this as your normal summon and send World Legacy World Chalice to the grave, producing 2 tokens, letting you go into Lib, which will let you set one of the World Legacy spell traps you need directly to the field, is really good. And you can even potentially search out a second one on your way to your Mekk Knight Crusadia Avermax if you go through your Mekk Knight of the Morning Star. So all of these factors combine really well to make it so that getting to the lock of your 3 World Legacy spell traps, coupled with a field full of Mekk Knights, is not as difficult as it used to be. The World Legacy spell traps that we talk about, obviously, are turning off monsters with World Legacy Secret, turning off spells with World Legacy Whispers, and finally, turning off traps with World Legacy Key. Once you've got these 3 on the field and 5 Mekk Knights, your opponent is pretty much going to be locked out of everything, and that can be extremely powerful. That being said, I hope you guys have enjoyed this. Make sure you do leave us a like, leave us a comment, leave us a subscribe. Later this week, we will be having test hands with this deck featured. And in a couple weeks, we will be also having this deck featured in a live match coming up. Leave in the comments below what deck featured on the channel you'd like to see this deck go up against. That being said, all I can say is I'll see you guys at the next video.